My mother looked me in the eyes, her face pale and her voice trembling as she begged me to save her life. "You're the only match, Liam. Please, I'm your mother," she sobbed. It was the first time she had spoken to me in 5 years since the rainy night she and my father threw my suitcases into the street because my medical bills were draining their retirement. They told the whole family I was a sickly burden and a broke loser who would never amount to anything. They thought they had discarded me like trash, but they didn't realize that the sick son they abandoned was now the only person standing between them and the grave. My father stood behind her, the same man who had changed the locks on our childhood home while I was in the ICU, now holding out his hands as if he hadn't spent the last half-decade, telling everyone I was dead. They didn't know that I hadn't just survived, I had thrived. I was the CEO of the very medical conglomerate that owned the hospital they were currently sitting in. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply reached into my briefcase and pulled out a certified invoice for $450,000, the exact amount of the inheritance they had illegally seized from my grandmother's trust while I was too ill to fight back. I slid the paper across the table and looked my mother dead in the eye. "I'll consider the surgery," I said, my voice as cold as the night they left me in the rain. "But first, you're going to pay for the life you stole from me, with interest." Before the story goes any further, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your world right now. The story of my demise began on my 21st birthday, the day I was diagnosed with a rare, aggressive autoimmune disorder that turned my body into a cage. At the time, I believed I was surrounded by a fortress of family love. My grandmother, a woman of iron will and secret wealth, had established a trust fund specifically for my future, worth nearly $500,000. She knew my parents, Susan and Mark, were obsessed with appearances and social climbing, and she didn't trust them with the money. But when she passed away just months after my diagnosis, I was too weak in a hospital bed to protect her legacy. My parents didn't see a sick son. They saw a financial drain that threatened their status in the suburban elite. While I was drifting in and out of consciousness during my first round of experimental treatments, Mark and Susan were busy behind the scenes. They used a forged power of attorney to gain access to my grandmother's trust, claiming I was mentally incapacitated and unable to manage my affairs. They didn't use that money for my doctors or my medications. Instead, they used it to pay off the mortgage on their country club lifestyle and to fund my brother's influencer startup. The betrayal reached its peak on a Tuesday night in November, a night I will never forget. I had just been discharged from the hospital, barely able to walk and needing oxygen support. When I pulled into the driveway, I found my suitcases sitting on the wet grass, soaked by a relentless freezing rain. My mother stood on the porch, her arms crossed, looking at me with a coldness that felt more lethal than my disease. "We've spent enough on your condition, Liam," she said, her voice flat and rehearsed. "The doctors say you're a lost cause, and we aren't going to let you drag us down into bankruptcy with you. You're a burden and we're done." My father didn't even come to the door. He simply watched from the window as I struggled to drag my bags to my beat-up car. They had already changed the locks and blocked my phone number. I spent the next 3 months living in that car, parked outside the hospital library so I could use their Wi-Fi. That was when the glow of my old life died and the fire of my new one began. I realized that if I was going to die, I was going to die fighting, not just for my health, but for the justice my grandmother intended for me. I began researching my own condition with the obsession of a man who had nothing left to lose. I found a clinical trial for a new gene therapy being developed by a small, struggling biotech firm in the city. I traded the last of my pride for a spot in that trial. While my body was being rebuilt by science, I was rebuilding my mind. I took a job as a night shift data analyst for the very company running the trial, working from a laptop in the hospital basement while the IV dripped into my arm. Over the next 3 years, the miracle happened. The therapy didn't just work. It thrived in my system. And as my health returned, so did my sharp analytical mind. I moved up through the company with a lethal efficiency, eventually identifying a massive flaw in their distribution model that was losing them millions. The board was so impressed, they offered me a seat, and eventually, the role of CEO. I rebranded the firm into Apex Medical Conglomerate, a billion-dollar entity that now owned the very hospital where my parents were currently begging for mercy. I kept my success a total secret from everyone who knew my old self. I wanted them to believe the sick and broke version of me was still out there, rotting in a gutter. I even hired a private investigator to track my parents' spending. I watched as they burned through my grandmother's trust, buying a lifestyle they couldn't sustain, never realizing that the burden they discarded was now the man who owned their debt. The janitor of justice was ready to sweep the floor. The backstory was finished. It was time for the surgical strike to begin. The escalation didn't start with a face-to-face confrontation. It started with a memorial service. I wasn't invited to, because I was the guest of honor. 2 years into my recovery, while I was quietly consolidating my power at Apex Medical Conglomerate, I discovered, through a private investigator, that my parents had told the entire extended family I had passed away from my complications. They didn't want to explain why their only son was living in a car, so they buried me in a lie to save their social standing. They even went as far as to set up a small, private memorial where they mourned my loss, all while using the last of my grandmother's trust fund to pay for the expensive catering. I watched the video of that service from my penthouse office, my blood turning to ice as I saw my mother dabbing fake tears with a silk handkerchief. She was telling our relatives how bravely I had fought and how peaceful my end had been. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, designed to ensure that no one would ever go looking for me. That was the moment I stopped being just a victim of their greed and became the architect of their downfall. The mirror paradox was perfect. To them, I was a ghost, and I decided to haunt them with the one thing they loved more than their own children, their money. The real surgical strike began when my father, Mark, tried to expand his failing architectural firm by taking out a high-interest commercial loan. He didn't know that the private equity group providing the funding was a shell company owned by Apex. I personally approved his loan, but I ensured the default clauses were written in invisible ink legal traps that would trigger if he missed even a single payment or if his asset disclosure was found to be fraudulent. I knew his disclosure was a lie because it listed my grandmother. His trust is his own personal equity. I wasn't just lending him money. I was handing him the rope he would eventually use to hang his own career. Months later, the medical crisis hit. My mother's kidneys began to fail, a hereditary condition that she had ignored for years while she was busy shopping with my stolen inheritance. When she was admitted to St. Jude's Medical Center, she thought she was in the best hands because of her insurance. She didn't realize that St. Jude's had been acquired by my conglomerate weeks earlier. I stayed in the shadows, watching her medical charts from my executive dashboard, seeing the no-match results pile up for a donor. My brother, the golden child who had spent his share of the stolen money on a failing lifestyle blog, refused to even get tested, claiming it would interfere with his fitness brand. My parents were desperate. They were staring into an abyss of medical debt and a ticking clock. That was when I instructed my head of legal to leak a tip to them. The tip suggested that their deceased son might actually be alive and living under a different name in the city. I wanted to see if they would come to me for an apology or for an organ. When they finally tracked me down to the Apex executive suites, they didn't come with flowers or a confession. They walked into my office with a lawyer, ready to demand that I fulfill my filial duty because they were bankrupt from my childhood medical bills, another lie they had started to believe themselves. They stood there looking at me in my $5,000 suit, their faces a mixture of horror and greed. They didn't even ask how I had survived. My mother just pointed at her side and said, "Liam, you have to help me. We're family." The ghost ledger was open on my desk, listing every penny they had stolen, every lie they had told at my funeral, and the default notice for my father's business loan. The escalation was over. The trap was shut. I leaned back in my chair, the janitor finally ready to throw out the trash, and told them the price of my mercy. "Family is an expensive word," I whispered. "And you're about to find out exactly how much you owe me." The silence in the executive office was so thick it felt heavy. My mother, Susan, stared at the $450,000 invoice on my desk as if it were a poisonous snake. My father, Mark, reached for his collar, his face turning a blotchy, desperate red as he realized the successful businessman he had been trying to impress for a loan was the same son he had left to die in a rain-soaked car. The mirror paradox was in full effect. They were standing in a room built by my success, yet they were still trying to use their old parental authority to manipulate me. "Liam, this is ridiculous," my father stammered, his voice lacking its usual predatory edge. "We're in a medical crisis. Your mother needs a donor, not a math lesson. We can talk about grandmother's money later." He tried to lean over my desk, reaching for the invoice as if he could just make it disappear. But my security detail stepped forward with clinical precision. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. "There is no later, Mark," I said, using his first name like a cold splash of water. "Every second you waste lying to me is a second Susan loses on the transplant list. You didn't come here because you missed your son. You came here because you ran out of people to rob." I tapped a button on my desk, and the large monitors on the wall flickered to life, displaying a surgical strike of data. It wasn't just the trust fund theft. It was the ghost ledger of every fraudulent expense they had filed since they kicked me out. I showed them the default notice on Mark's business loan, the one I had personally bought out. I showed them the deed to their house, which was now legally in the hands of my holding company due to their repeated financial inconsistencies. "You don't own that house anymore," I said, my voice echoing with the weight of 5 years of survival. "You don't own your cars, and you certainly don't own the Golden Child's startup, which I just finished acquiring in a hostile takeover this morning." My mother let out a small, broken gasp, clutching her side, as if the physical pain of her illness was finally catching up to the psychological reality of her bankruptcy. "How could you do this to your own family?" she whispered, the fake tears from my memorial service, now replaced by the real terror of a woman who had lost her safety net. "Family?" I stood up, the janitor finally finishing the sweep. "Family doesn't hold a funeral for a living son to hide their crimes. Family doesn't steal a sick person's medicine money to pay for a country club membership." I leaned in, the glow of my power filling the room. "You want my kidney? Fine, but here is the price for my filial duty. You have 24 hours to gather the entire extended family, the aunts, the uncles, and the cousins you lied to, and confess every single thing you did." I slid a second document toward them. "You will sign a full confession and a repayment agreement for the $450,000 plus interest. If you do, I will walk into that operating room and save your life. Susan, if you don't, or if you try to lie one more time, I will initiate the immediate eviction from the house and the business, and I will hand this ghost ledger to the district attorney by noon tomorrow." The power flip was absolute. They weren't the parents anymore. They were the defendants. I watched as Mark's hand shook while he picked up the pen, the Golden Child's father finally realizing that the only burden in this family was the one he saw in the mirror. 24 hours, I repeated, my voice as sharp as a scalpel. The clock is ticking. The legal climax took place exactly 24 hours later in the grand ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel, a venue my parents had booked months ago to celebrate my brother's influencer award, using the last of their credit. They thought they were gathering the family for a party, but I had repurposed the event into a courtroom. As the extended family sat at round tables, whispering about the mystery donor who was going to save Susan, I stepped onto the stage. The room went deathly silent as the dead son walked into the light, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that broadcasted a level of wealth they couldn't comprehend. "Most of you were told I died 3 years ago," I began, my voice amplified by the professional sound system I had installed for the surgical strike. My aunts and cousins gasped, some dropping their glasses, as I looked directly at my parents sitting in the front row. But I didn't die. I was discarded. And tonight, before I consider saving the life of the woman who threw me into the rain, the truth will be told. I gestured to the massive projection screen behind me. It didn't show childhood photos. It showed the ghost ledger. The screen displayed a side-by-side comparison. My grandmother's original trust documents and the forged power of attorney my father had signed while I was in the ICU. I showed the bank statements of my stolen $450,000 being used to buy my brother's luxury SUV and my mother's designer wardrobe. The mirror paradox was undeniable. The grieving parents were exposed as common thieves in front of everyone they had ever tried to impress. "Mark, Susan," I said, looking down at them, "the microphone is yours. You have the next 5 minutes to confirm these documents are real," or my legal team, standing by at the back of the room, Will immediately file the criminal charges I've already prepared. My father stood up, his legs shaking. The golden child persona completely shattered. He looked at the shocked faces of his siblings and colleagues and realized there was no escape. "It's true," he whispered into the microphone, his voice cracking with a cowardice that made the room turn cold. We took the money. We told everyone he was dead because we couldn't admit we were broke from his medical bills. We forged the papers." My mother sobbed, not out of regret, but because the social mask she had worn for decades was being ripped away in front of a live audience. My brother tried to slip out the back door, but my security blocked his exit. "You're staying for the end, Tyler," I called out. "Since you enjoyed the money, you'll enjoy the fallout." As the confession finished, I signaled to my lead counsel, who stepped forward with a stack of debt assumption papers. "By signing these, you officially admit to the theft of $450,000 and agree to the immediate seizure of your remaining assets to begin repayment," the lawyer announced. They signed, their hands trembling, as the medical shock of their public downfall began to set in. I walked to the edge of the stage and looked at my mother. "The truth is out, Susan. You're no longer a bereaved mother. You're a convicted fraud," I said with clinical finality. "And now, because I am not like you, I will do what you refuse to do for me. I've scheduled the transplant for 6:00 a.m. tomorrow." The room erupted in murmurs, but I wasn't done. "But don't think this is a reconciliation. I'm saving your life so you can live long enough to pay back every single cent you stole. I'm not giving you a kidney because I love you. I'm giving it to you so you can spend the rest of your life as my debtor." The resolution didn't happen in a hospital room filled with flowers and hugs. It happened in the quiet, sterile silence of the recovery ward. The surgery was a success. And as the glow of my health returned with a strength I hadn't felt in years, my mother woke up to a reality she could no longer manipulate. I was gone before she even opened her eyes. I didn't need her thank you, and I certainly didn't want her apologies. To me, the kidney wasn't a gift. It was a signature on a contract that guaranteed she would live to see the consequences of her choices. In the months that followed, the surgical strike on my family's old life was completed with lethal efficiency. My father's architectural firm went into a court-ordered liquidation, and every penny from the sale was funneled directly into the Apex Medical Foundation, a branch of my company that provides free healthcare to abandoned children. My parents were forced to move into a tiny, state-subsidized apartment, the same kind of place they had mocked me for living in when I was sick and broke. My brother, Tyler, lost his golden child status along with his luxury car, eventually finding work as a delivery driver to pay back his share of the stolen inheritance. I found my own peace not in the revenge, but in the restoration of my grandmother's legacy. I took the $450,000 I recovered and built a specialized recovery wing at the hospital, naming it after her. I still lead Apex Medical Conglomerate, but I spend my weekends mentoring young patients who have been told they are burdens by their families. The mirror paradox is finally complete. My parents are alive because of me, but they have lost the only thing they ever truly cared about, their status. They live in a world where everyone knows their names not as elites, but as the people who tried to bury their own son. I walked away from that hospital with one less kidney, but a soul that was finally, for the first time in 5 years, entirely my own. The janitor has finished the final sweep, and the house of cards is gone for good.